Welcome to this workshop of the Citizens Research Foundation, which we have organized in collaboration with the Institute of Governmental Studies, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Stephen and Michelle Kirsch Foundation in Silicon Valley. The patron saint of the CRF is the late great comedian Fred Allen, who said, "There are many things in life more important than money, and they all cost money." From our point of view, this puts money in its proper perspective. We care about money because we care about the practical prerequisites of modern democracy. We care about political competition, about deliberation over public policy, about the dissemination of politically relevant information, about the free expression of opinion, about freedom to assemble and to petition the government for the redress of grievances, and about institutions and practices that help in achieving these ends. And they all cost money. As the title of our foundation suggests, we are committed to the notion that research has a central role, indeed it's right in the middle, has a central role to play in discovering the complicated relationships among the means and the ends I've just mentioned. It is a peculiar privilege of a university-based organization like ours that we're obliged to seek knowledge about these complex relations, even where the fires of public controversy burn at their hottest. Our job, the job of scholars in the social sciences, is to put on our asbestos suits and go to work disentangling the claims that can be backed up with facts from claims that can't, seeking always to improve the reliability and the soundness of the empirical premises upon which political opinions, social policy, and political actions are based. This was the rationale for our long-term commitment, honored especially by our predecessor, Herb Alexander, to find and publish basic facts about political fundraising and campaign expenditures. Now that these statistics are widely available, as they were not when Herb started his fruitful labors 30 years ago, the focus of the Foundation efforts have shifted toward the following intermediate goals: to sponsor careful analyses of information elucidating the relations between the raising and spending of money in politics as they affect the bedrock institutions and practices of democracy, to encourage researchers to come to their own conclusions about these issues without requiring adherence to an institutional line, to encourage discussion of these issues by new and young scholars and by scholars who've not previously participated in research on political money, to provide a forum that will be hospitable to conversation and collaboration through a nationwide scholars network. This workshop is an example of the way we would like to see things work in this field. While recognizing the place of advocacy and even partisan disputation in this field, we nevertheless want ourselves to claim a place at the table for disinterested scholarship and for the intellectual priorities that scholars in this field may establish for themselves. And so we thank you all for coming here to join us. We look forward to learning from your contributions to the ongoing conversation.
I want to start by spending a few minutes talking about what I have been doing for the last 5 years, occasionally with Josh and some others, and then in this area, and then go on to talk about what we might do and the research agenda. I got more actively engaged in this subject, both in the public arena and in the policy arena, in about 1995, as I saw a couple of things. One was I really sensed as we moved into the 1996 cycle that at the federal level things were just going to careen out of control. That the broad dikes we had put in place to deal with discourse spending and the nature of campaigns were crumbling around us. And you could begin to see this particularly with the dramatic upsurge in outside money coming in unusual ways. I'd also been disheartened by the nature of the agenda and the discourse inside Washington, where both parties had settled into a very comfortable for them dialogue based on false choices. Democrats were delighted to be out there saying we have a solution to this. It is spending limits and public financing. And Republicans were delighted to say we draw the line in the dust, no spending limits, no public financing. And they could each have issues with their own constituencies and be sure that almost nothing would happen. And at the same time, the journalists, as Frank Soroff pointed out very nicely in that wonderful article he wrote in public, where was it? PSQ, that what we as a community had to offer was almost entirely ignored by journalists because it didn't fit their own predispositions. I thought we could change that dialogue some and change it in an appropriate way. So what I did in really at the beginning of 1996 was to bring together a small group of people to try and talk things through, decide what goals were achievable here, and maybe to come up with a somewhat different agenda. So I brought in basically three political scientists, myself, Tom Mann, and Michael Malbin. One campaign finance lawyer, Trevor Potter, the former chairman of the FEC, and Paul Taylor, a journalist who'd been out there very active on the free TV front. A couple of others also participated, but we sat down over several sessions and worked things through, talked about what realistically could be done and should be done. Now, let me say we started with a couple of assumptions here. One assumption was, to get back to something I suggested earlier, that there is no nirvana, but also that there's no magic bullet. There is no solution to the problem of money in politics. So I and most of my colleagues would not accept the idea that there is an ultimate goal of full public funding, believing that it's just not going to work the way people think it's going to work. And I believe if we begin to go through the unintended consequences or the simple reality of all the money that's out there outside any system, that there is no conceivable way of bringing it all into a system, it's not going to solve the problems that people think it would solve, even if you could get past the practical reality there would have to be a massive sum of public money brought in. Now that's at the federal level, and I'm delighted to have experiments at the state level, although I frankly am skeptical that if Maine moved in this direction in a full-scale fashion, that it would work or that Maine voters would be willing to put up the kind of money necessary. But we will see, and it's great that we can have that happen. A second is most of us had great skepticism about spending limits, and I continue to have that skepticism. I think you could set spending limits high enough, but if you look at, say, congressional races, given the incredible disparity with equal population in different districts, you inevitably are going to set levels that are too low in some places, too high to have any meaning in others, and just right in only a small number, and then the next cycle you may have a different regimen in place, a different nature of districts. So I continue to believe that they're not terribly effective. And now when I look at all the outside money, I fear what consequences would flow from that. But regardless, we sat down and we worked things through, and we came up with a plan which we put out there as 5 ideas for campaign reform. Partly it was 5 because we thought that's all people could reasonably digest, but also because it seemed to fit, and we wanted to make this as simple as possible. It was incremental, small change reform. And one other assumption I might suggest, which is something Josh referred to, which is there is no solution that's going to last for a long period of time. This is like tax reform. There are just too many people, the best and brightest in the society, who have an enormous interest in finding ways around a regime. And if you're lucky, it'll last for 10 years. I think, in fact, the public financing system of the presidential campaign was an enormous success because it lasted for more than 10 years. It fell apart. It has fallen apart. But that's about all you can hope for. And as we look at the changes in communications moving forward, the way in which people communicate in the society, there's almost no way we can put something in place now that's going to have great application in 5 or 10 years when we don't have a clue as to what kind of advertising will take place. I haven't read this piece yet, but the Sunday Times Magazine has a piece by Michael Lewis on how television technology could destroy advertising as we know it. Commercial advertising and political advertising are two sides of the same coin. And you look at the nature of targeting, the nature of messages, it's all going to change. So we've got to take that into account as well. We were concerned about corruption, but as I suggested the other day, I think we as a society, but in particular those of us in our community, have also misread the nature of corruption. Corruption and the reality of it is not very much donors coming in and buying politicians in return for votes. It may happen here and there. I would argue from 30 years of close experience in Washington, it happens less than it did 30 years ago. The dramatic change has been corruption in the other direction, which is people with levers of power given by the state shaking down donors. And those donors include big donors and lobbyists. And it's happening more and more because the stakes are higher, the majorities are up for grabs, the intensity level is greater. The desire to move into leadership positions has changed so that now the best way to do it is to develop your own leadership fund of money and shake down people for that purpose that you can distribute around in different ways. And I can't tell you how many lobbyists have complained to me privately, they won't do it publicly, that they are regularly being extorted, their own personal money. That hurts them much more than those they represent, by political figures at a level that is illegal, but it's not going to come out. I mean, people saying, members and their funders saying, if you want this to come up on the agenda, you better be there for this fundraiser, that sort of thing. A belief that if you have no limits on contributions, you take away that armor of protection from donors, where you can no longer say, sorry, I've maxed out. And as I suggested the other day, you have increasing examples of people being shaken down repeatedly and more harshly. That helps to explain, by the way, why that survey result of big donors suggested that majorities favor eliminating soft money and putting limits in place, because most of them would much prefer to exert their influence without giving their money away. They have other things they'd like to do with their money, including their corporate money or their personal money, and they know they can have significant influence without it if that's taken away. They spend the money because they want insurance, they want protection, they want access insurance in many instances, and because they're threatened in other ways. Second, we were concerned about the barriers to entry and saw what I saw anecdotally over 30 years of watching closely and interacting with new classes of members of Congress every 2 years was a disturbing decline in quality. Not necessarily basic intelligence, but quality. And looking out there, you could just see from what the party officials would tell you, what everybody would tell you, you'll never have a shortage of people willing to run. But clearly the pool was shrinking. And a part of that was the larger number of uncontested seats and just the dynamics of this. A third element, which we haven't talked about very much, but which I think is an extremely important one, is the whole nature of campaign discourse as a vital component of the broader deliberative process. And here I think we could use some work on theory and practice. As I see it, campaigns are a part of the deliberative process as you move through from the campaign to the election. It's not just voters choosing between candidates. It's framing issues, it's setting up an agenda that then moves into the policy process, but it's also being able to look at candidates, see what they're saying, see what they stand for, see what kind of support they have, gauging those things as well. It has to be done with a common base of communication in a public square. And I believe two things have been happening. The first is we're poisoning the discourse. It's not the negativity so much as it is the flood coming in from other sources where, as Dave said so eloquently, it's impossible to tell who's saying what or who stands for what or who's with whom. And the candidates are being drowned out in this process. You don't want only candidates to be out there in discourse, but a part of a campaign is candidates should be the most significant features here for voters to see. At the same time, in the nature of our communications process, the public square is shrinking, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to have messages shared across the broader range of voters. That may have some implications for the whole nature of our democracy if we lose some elements of that public square. The temptation to move to narrower and narrower and more focused communications with smaller groups of voters will make it harder to build broader coalitions and also will endanger the fabric of society, I believe. And finally, we were concerned, I in particular, by the decline proportionally of small donors in the system, which I believe really does date from the removal of the tax credit in 1986. I might note as a historical footnote that the late Dick Conlon, one of my mentors in politics from my time as a congressional fellow, former head of the Democratic Study Group, was passionately for the tax credit for small donors, worked incredibly hard, and actually got in the Ways and Means Committee the one amendment to the Tax Reform Act to put back in a tax credit, and it was removed by Common Cause. Common Cause was singularly responsible for ending the tax credit for small donors. One of the more shameful moments, I would argue, in the reform movement. But I believe we needed to find ways to bring small donors back, partly as well because of the whole nature of democracy. I liken the small donor process to pools on the NCAA and Final Four. Most of us have them at my office. Everybody puts in $5. And in the weeks surrounding the NCAA tournament, I'll walk around and have people who know little about and care little about basketball discoursing at length on the relative merits of the power forwards at Kansas State and Missouri because they've got a stake in the system now. And I think if you can encourage people to give small amounts, they will develop a larger stake in the political process, and you can broaden the base of people involved in politics. So what did we do? Just to go briefly through some of the things. We called for an end to soft money, but in what we believed was a more appropriate way than some of the things that have been put out there. An end to soft money because there were two reasons. One is, I think if you have soft money and hard money, you have a ridiculous regulatory regime. Money should be money. It should be fungible. And once you start to say you can use this sum of money for some purposes and this money for others, you invite the worst kinds of abuses. So there should be one kind of money. But if you have no limits, you encourage that kind of corruption in the opposite direction. So what we suggested was the most prudent way to do this was to end federal soft money, to ban transfers between and among the states or between the states and the national parties, and then to increase the hard money limits on what individuals could contribute to the political parties. One of the things that is missing from many of these reform proposals, including, unfortunately, the McCain-Feingold bill that's out there now, is they call for an end to soft money, but keep in place limits which include an overall limit for what an individual can give in a year to both parties and to candidates. You can give a total of $25,000 with a sublimit of $20,000 in hard money to parties. Now, if you have no soft money outlet, then you end soft money, and in effect you have parties at war with their own candidates to get to the same sums of money. It's a foolish thing to do. So what we called for was a separate limit on what individuals could give. What we recommended was $25,000 a year, indexed, everything indexed to inflation, for the parties, and $25,000 for the candidates. In effect saying you got to have adequate money for parties for party building, but money should be fungible. And we also suggested if you're going to do this, remove the statutory limits on what parties can give to individual candidates. Then let them spend the money however they wish within that kind of regimen. We put out the first cut proposal on what to do about sham issue ads. And in this case, and here we differed with Josh among others, our first cut was to identify ads as those that mention the name of a candidate within 60 days of an election, and we basically brought them under the same regimen as candidate ads. Subsequently, and I'll talk about this in a minute, we went back and revised that, but it was the first cut proposal out there, which got incorporated into McCain-Feingold after we talked to McCain into Feingold. We call for increasing the limits on individual contributions to candidates from $1,000 to, we didn't suggest an exact amount, but we said at minimum you should bring it up to take into account inflation over the previous quarter century, which would have been between $3,000 and $3,500. We called for a 100% tax credit for contributions of $100 or less, and a matching system of vouchers for free television time for candidates who raised over a threshold in small contributions, believing you need an incentive for small donors to give, but you also need a substantial incentive for candidates to raise that kind of money because the cost-benefit ratio is just out of whack. It costs more to raise small donations in most cases, especially if you do it not just through direct mail, but through things like a $25 a head barbecue, the kind of retail campaigning you'd like to bring back. And we also called for reform of the Federal Election Commission, believing that the system had lost all basic restraints. There's no law anymore, and it's flouting the law. League of Women Voters backed this. We got a fairly major advertising campaign that year, and we had a significant role in moving from McCain-Feingold in its first version to the second version of McCain-Feingold, and also most of the ideas incorporated in the freshman plan that emerged after that election from Tom Allen and Asa Hutchinson were ours, including this different idea in soft money, which was attacked in turn by Common Cause, among others, rather than eliminating all soft money and doing nothing about the way in which you have hard money interlaced between candidates and parties. After this proposal got out there, and much of it debated on the floor, we began to have second thoughts about the applicability and the constitutionality of the Sham Issue Ad proposal that we had put out there. So I convened a slightly larger group that in this case included Dan Ortiz from the University of Virginia Law School and Joshua Rosenkrantz, who clerked for several judges. And we went through a long and a fascinating intellectual deliberative process to try and come up with something that would make a difference, be practical, fit within Berkeley, and have some impact. That ultimately, as we put this together, and a lot of it done over the internet with an interchange, a lot between Dan Ortiz, who drafted the proposal in legislative language, Josh, and the rest of us kibitzed a bit from the sidelines. Then, at just the right moment, Senator Olympia Snowe called me up, and she had tried to find a way to deal with what had become a critical and probably insurmountable problem on the Senate floor, which was the Republican insistence on doing something about paycheck protection. Was there a way to deal with this issue that would achieve some bipartisan support? She wanted to know. And I said, have we got some ideas for you? And went in, and ultimately these ideas got incorporated into what became the Snowe-Jeffords Amendment that was accepted on the Senate floor, albeit with the same 52 votes that had come in for other proposals, but is now there on the table. It makes a distinction between different kinds of communications, focuses on broadcast ads over a threshold amount, defines ads in terms of both the closeness to the election and the targeting of the audience and the name of the candidate, says that for such electioneering ads, we would ban corporate and union contributions, fitting in with a long legal tradition of these things, and also called for different alternative disclosure regimens to try and deal with the legitimate objections of organizations that didn't want to have necessarily all their donor lists given out to everybody. So we offered an alternative where you could have targeted funds, you could have a separate account. What I think will be a model ultimately for what is done in this area. Now, I did not include in some of these some additional ideas that I would just throw out to you that I've put out in other venues. One is to have a seed money mechanism, something I've sort of been touting for the last 10 years, to try to make it easier for candidates to run. And that suggestion is that early in a campaign, candidates could raise up to $100,000 in contributions of up to $10,000, so that you could actually get a campaign underway, maybe test the waters, get over that initial hurdle, and have donors disclosed immediately at an early stage of a campaign. Another was an idea that I've been grappling with what we could do with multimillionaire candidates. And so another suggestion was that if you are running against somebody putting a substantial sum of his or her own money in, that as that candidate reaches threshold amounts, say $100,000 of his or her own money, the opposing candidate could raise up to that amount in larger contribution amounts, $10,000, and so on in increments, so that you would have a way for a candidate to counter massive sums coming in from an individual spending his own money. There are ideas out there that I think could build broad bipartisan support and actually do something in targeted fashion that would last for some period of time. But recognizing that where, for example, on these sham issue ads, we focus on broadcasting, that may be the prime medium for communications for a long time to come. I suspect it will because of the desire to reach the broader public. The costs are going to continue to rise, even as the audience for those shrinks, because it's the only way to reach across this larger audience. But ultimately, there may be other forms of communication. And, you know, at that point, what we've done may not work anymore, and you may have to revisit. And so there's always that in mind. The other element to this, by the way, is that I also worked with Lieberman early on, saying, beware of these 527s, and we actually had a piece of legislation drafted that was in place, fortunately, when they were able to take it up and you could pull it off the shelf and pretty much implement it. Part of this is to get ideas out there, hammer them through, get them in legislative form for a time when the debate is ripe to do something, with no illusions that this will solve lots of problems. And the whole idea here is to try and move the system a little bit to try and achieve or move towards desirable goals, more of them process than policy goals, and recognizing that they aren't going to last for any length of time, but that they're desirable ones. Finally, over the last 3 years, I was co-chair of a presidential advisory committee on the public interest obligations of digital television broadcasters, along with Leslie Moonves, the president of CBS. And there I worked in a separate but related effort to try and figure out ways to get free TV time for candidates, believing that there is no way of getting free TV time for all candidates. It is unworkable and shouldn't be out there, but there ought to be ways that would not unduly burden broadcasters, that would create more opportunities for candidates who have no ability to get a message across. What I came up with there was what I believe is a win-win situation, and it basically is for broadcasters voluntarily to provide, in the 30 nights before an election, 5 minutes per evening, defined as between 5 p.m. and 11:35 p.m., of candidate-centered discourse, spread throughout the evening however they wish, with the local stations choosing the races that are not getting enough time, that matter and that need the time, and choosing the formats. No content regulation, nothing more than you provide time for some candidates, believing that in an area that might have 6, 7, 8, 10 television stations that would pick some overlap of races, some not, that probably integrated mostly in the newscasts, that you'd have a lot of candidates having multiple opportunities to actually get a message across at different levels that don't get them now. We've had modest success in this area. The Scripps television stations have signed on and did it in several early primaries with some success. Capital Broadcasting in North Carolina applied this to their gubernatorial primary, and the Hearst stations have applied it in different places, and it's worked very, very well. The networks have not signed on at all, and I will tell you from now vast experience, there is no more rapacious or less public interested group in the entire society than the broadcasters. I would note here finally in this area that to give my own credentials, I have been called a tool of corporate interests by Ellen Miller and John Moyers, an enemy of the First Amendment by Douglas Johnson of the National Right to Life Committee, biased against broadcasters by Eddie Fritz, the head of the NAB, and dangerous by Tom DeLay. And I wear them all proudly.
I'll know how to introduce you better next
yes,
time.
that's right. When Eddie Fritz sent a letter to the president calling for my removal the day after I was announced as the co-chair of this commission, and I commented the next day that I could understand why a poor defenseless organization like the NAB would fear a big, powerful academic such as myself. Now, finally, what about research? First, I really applaud what John Krasno and his colleagues and what Dave Magleby and his colleagues have done. We've got to reach out there and get data on ads, all ads. We've got to find out what they're doing and what they're saying. And I think there is nothing more significant for the Supreme Court now, or for anything that we want to do about electioneering, than these findings that show that 4%, to turn it the other way around, 4% of candidate campaign ads use so-called magic words. We need a bright line, given the court's reasoning, almost certainly. But it's clear they drew the line in the wrong place. And whether they drew it in the wrong place out of naivete, or they drew it in the wrong place in a permanent fashion, or they drew it in the right place at the time, but the times have changed, is almost immaterial. What's clear is they drew the line in the wrong place. And we can redraw it and I think stay within the framework of Buckley realistically and do something here. We need generally more on TV and more work on television. What we have seen in a number of places is something that I find profoundly disturbing. It began with, I think, with the California gubernatorial primary last time around, and that is an inverse relationship between coverage of political races and the amount of advertising done. And I think what happened is that station managers in California came to a revelation, which is that if they covered campaigns less, the demand from candidates and others would increase because it would be the only way they could get a message across. Now, I'm not sure that this pernicious intent has spread entirely widely, but it's there and it's happening increasingly. And they're finding that the amount of money they're pulling in from these ads is immense, and the coverage is declining. And something has to be done about that, but the first thing that has to be done is we have to have data that shows that this is the case and in a widespread way, and it has to be spread out there. We also need to look at the mix that broadcasters are employing. What ads more? We've got some data here. What ads are coming from outside groups, from parties, from candidates? And one part of this, by the way, is one of the well-intended but I think now unworkable elements of previous reform is we have a discount television rate for candidates, the so-called lowest unit rate. It's not very effective anymore because time buying has changed. But imagine if you are a broadcaster and you have a law that requires you to provide reasonable access to candidates at a discount rate. Al Checky comes in and says, I'll buy the best time and I'll give you not just retail but a 20% bonus over retail. Republicans for Clean Air or Citizens for All Good Things come in and say, I want to buy a lot of ad time and I'll give you full retail or maybe a little bit more. And the parties buy issue ads at full retail. And then you got the candidates coming in who get a discount. Now all that is in addition to regular advertisers, because broadcasters hate all of these ads at one level because it means they have to take their advertisers who are with them all year round in a 2-year cycle, not those who are there for 2 months out of a 2-year cycle, and give them less time. But the allure is great. Most broadcasters are going to say to the candidates, I'll give you reasonable access. All the time you want to buy at 3 a.m., it's yours. We don't know what's happening here, and we've got to know more about this. We also need to know more about what changes are taking place in campaign communications. What is going to the internet? What is going to direct mail? How much are we moving in a direction of narrow cast communications through cable television or through different kinds of demographics? And I'm not sure what research models we can use to do this. It's going to take some substantial resources. But if we don't get a handle on this, we're going to be out of the loop before very long. And finally, I'd like to see some people survey large donors and lobbyists to get more than anecdotal information about the nature of the shakedowns going on now, so that we can have some body of evidence about that element of what I believe is real corruption in the process. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
I'm with the government and I'm here to help you. That's the way I always begin these things. This has actually turned out to be the reverse. I'm very happy to have been invited. I'm also sort of a backup player. There are a couple of people who would like to have been here and were unable to, and would better represent, I think, the state of current research on parties. But they gave me an opportunity to do this. And one of the things that was most beneficial to me about this morning is I don't get exposed so much to this literature anymore, and to the kinds of work that people are doing, because they can get access to information much more directly than people used to be able to do. And so hopefully this will help me understand better what your questions are and what kinds of issues you're thinking about and trying to work with, and hopefully that will result in the Commission, to the extent that it continues to be possible for the Commission to do anything worthwhile, even in the context of disclosure, that we'll be able to make the information more relevant to the kinds of questions that you're addressing. That's also a particular advantage in the context of party research, because it's on the one hand, it's the one place where we still have fairly rich data, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is and how it hopefully will also improve over the short run. It's also an area where the questions are perhaps most intractable, and certainly in the context of reform, most important. In that context, I'll also say by way of introduction, you clearly have the ear, you as a discipline, clearly have the ear of the federal judiciary in this context. There are federal judges all around the country, even as recently as yesterday, who have expressed an interest in understanding what you think about the kinds of questions that are raised, particularly as they relate to the regulation of parties vis-a-vis campaign finance. And so this research is important, and it needs to be done carefully, and some of that sort of falls behind what I'll say. First, the more mundane, the kinds of information that are available about parties currently reflect probably the ideal for those who suggest that the best reform is full disclosure and not much more than that. What we have now in the case of national political party organizations is presumably the disclosure of virtually all of their activities in a central location in one place, and we have that information. And Ray is one of the people who has been most aggressive in terms of trying to make sense of that information and the data that we've created from it, and work with it and get some insight from it. And that's a very important task. It's one that I've been trying to encourage for a number of years and have had some difficulty with. All the data at the FEC is a little weird in one respect or another. There are nuances and idiosyncrasies in the law and in the way that the Commission has regulated this process that make it hard to understand. This is particularly true in the case of political party organizations. You need to understand the rules about allocating hard and soft money, for example, and the rules that apply to the reporting of that information. But once you've gotten through that, I think, as Ray has suggestively found, there are real opportunities for a better understanding of the way in which parties work, the kinds of impacts that party behavior and financial growth that they've experienced over the years might have for their institutional strength and for other kinds of issues, and that's really important work to be done. So I'm not pretending that it's easy because we have all the data, but it's at least approachable. The other sort of mechanical process that will make that somewhat more approachable as time goes on is that beginning next year, all of those organizations are going to file their reports with us electronically rather than on paper. And so you're no longer going to be dependent on our ability to translate the information into data, and that's a somewhat limited ability. We don't computerize everything we get on these sometimes 50,000 pages of paper that we get from party organizations. Beginning in the 2002 election cycle, the information that they still have to disclose will be disclosed electronically. And that'll be true not just of political party organizations, but also federal candidates, beyond a certain dollar threshold of activity, political action committees, all the kinds of institutions that presumably will continue to exist and continue to report to us. That's both an opportunity and a challenge. It makes accessible much more information about the nature of these organizations and the way in which they work. The challenge is we have to weed through all that data now, and certainly it's more efficient to do that way. But to come to an understanding of it is perhaps more difficult than it seems, and that's another example of the nature of just disclosure kinds of regulation. It's hard to make sense of soft money information from the FEC in part because it's a game without rules. We don't structure in the same way, the sources of revenue for those non-federal accounts of national party organizations that we do on the hard dollar side. And the reason is there's no guidance in a statute that would dictate that for us. There's no differential, if you will, between the contribution limits for individuals or institutions. One of the probably most important impacts that the FECA had in the mid-1970s was to structure the nature of this process and the kinds of money involved. I'm not sure it changed very much, but it imposed a structure on it. That structure doesn't exist in pure disclosure kinds of scenarios necessarily, and to the extent that it becomes more obscure, even though you have data, it's not necessarily helpful data. The first best example of that will probably come, another good example of that will come when we begin to see the information from the IRS on this Section 527 committees, or organizations that are going to begin to file disclosure reports. They're not, I will tell you, in those reports going to say, we spent money in this particular congressional race. They're going to say we paid this particular institution this much money on this date, and they'll describe the purpose of that payment. But assigning that to a particular race or a particular political goal for the organization is going to be difficult. It's another example of how more information doesn't necessarily generate more knowledge and better understanding, and the structure of this process is as important as the simple fact of its existence. And that's something that will be sort of a continuing theme. The other great advantage of doing things like research agendas is I can talk about questions that I don't have to worry about trying to answer. That's for you all who are much younger and more energetic than I. And so I'm not going to limit my discussion of the problems that I think, the issues that I think are important, to just the information, just the areas where I think there are data. The law of available data is a real serious problem here, and I'm a sinner in some respects because as we make this information approachable, sort of, we also to some extent dictate the research agenda, and that's a big problem, and we ought not do that. It's inevitable. It's not something we set out to do. It just happens. So, in the context of parties, what kinds of questions are most important, particularly in the context of reform? And it gets me back immediately, I think, to this notion of corruption that we started to talk about this morning. And that has been where your discipline has had the most impact, I think, in the judiciary over time in the recent past. And it has to do with this particular question. Because parties are more aggressive and they get into court more on more interesting issues, and because the judicial decisions are more difficult perhaps there, and partly because the research that I'm more familiar with these days comes out of depositions than it comes out of the journals. I'm concerned about a couple of things. One is this notion that is attributed to your discipline. I keep saying your discipline. I really am much further removed. I can't pretend to be a political scientist really anymore. I'm just a mid-level bureaucrat at a failed regulatory institution.
Why'd you have to walk to the mic?
So try to remember that context as you listen to what I say. Right. The notion that of course that parties cleanse somehow the revenue they receive and that they launder money in the positive sense and that the goals, the desirable characteristics of political parties outweigh the perhaps difficult or even untoward consequences of large dollar contributions to party organizations, that's significantly distinct from large dollar contributions for candidates. Gets at this kind of this corruption notion, and it strikes me that we, at least when we communicate with judges around the country, have a fairly simplistic view of that. And I think good research needs to poke a little bit at that pretty simple assumption. And how do we do that? One of the ways I think is to put it in an historical context. We used to always, when I was in graduate school, read about the fact that political party organizations, particularly national committees, were basically captured by presidential campaigns and were an arm of the presidential candidates when they ran for office. And so the distinction between party and candidate, if it ever existed, it certainly disappeared, at least in the context of the national committees, in presidential election campaigns. One wonders, given the experience of 1996, to what extent that's no longer true. it certainly seemed to be the case that both national committees were pretty captured by their presidential campaigns in that year, and even in the year before for the President's Party, and that's not unusual either in our history. And so the notion that that candidates are somehow insulated from the effects of large dollar contributions going to parties as opposed to going directly to campaigns seems to be problematic from that standpoint. And so we need to impose a little empirical discipline, it seems to me, on those kinds of issues and describe them or analyze them a little more carefully than I think we've done. Another sort of perhaps idiosyncratic example of why that's important that comes from that campaign too, and I guess I'm sort of obsessed with '96. That's understandable, maybe from my chair. The idea that the description of the behavior of the party chairman, for example. We know that Haley Barbour and Don Fowler, at least it's been asserted, and I have no reason to believe it's not true, that both those national chairmen were also registered lobbyists at the same time that they were chairman of their parties, and they were paid by interest to lobby on their behalf. We know, for example, that Haley Barbour lobbied the state assembly in Arizona on behalf of tobacco interests in the interest of getting that assembly to avoid the lawsuits on tobacco. We know Don Fowler's role basically as the concierge at Hotel White House in 1996, right? Again, all it really does is raise the question about the nature of that distinction between parties and candidates. And I don't mean to be so sort of trite about that. It's a serious question, and I don't mean to belittle the importance of party as a coalescing kind of organization that structures our politics in a positive way. I don't mean to suggest that that's not very important, but it needs to be placed in context, and we need to describe it that way, I think. And so better empirical research on those kinds of questions, difficult though I understand that is, would be helpful in the context, I think, of the evolving regulatory process. There are a number of other kinds of research questions that come from the evolution in party behavior and in campaign finance that are real opportunities and will provide interesting results that also probably address some of these questions as well. One of them is what's the real role of party? How do we understand the role of party now in the nature of campaigning, and how has that evolved over time? For example, national committees now have a much larger role. We know from Paul Hernson's research and others, a much larger role in candidate recruitment, and it's much closer tied to the financial resources that are available to those parties. When I was in graduate school, I worked on something called a party transformation project that Neil Cotter and John Bibby and Jim Gibson did at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the late 1970s. And one of the questions there was party institutionalization at the state level. What difference did it make? And as graduate students, we thought it was pretty clear that the difference was that in the context of candidate-centered campaigns, parties had a big advantage in providing services to candidates, that they could do it more efficiently, that they could raise money better than new candidates could. And so that was the mechanism through which this kind of professionalization of the parties would show itself in the political process. And there are a number of different studies that are assessing that now too, I think, and judging whether or not that actually took place. And that's important work. And if, in fact, the parties have a larger influence in recruitment and certainly in the guidance of particularly non-incumbent campaigns in a congressional sense, than they did before, then what does that say about the distinction between parties and candidates? And get back to this notion of corruption. We need to better understand, I think, what the relationship between those party organizations and the candidates are in order to make sense of that. And the flip side of that, the other part of that process, is what difference has institutionalizations of the parties made to the parties themselves? Paul Beck, I know, is doing some work in this area that's going to be important. Are the state party organizations now simply captives of the national parties? Are they so dependent on national party money that they have no independent sort of role anymore? That they're just funnels through which we do more efficiently issue advocacy that's guided by national considerations? One of the interesting dynamics is when I first went to the commission, it was clear to me that the Republican Party was much more institutionalized and much more nationalized than the Democratic Party. Democratic state committees still pretty much did what they wanted, and the DNC sometimes got in their way, but more often couldn't. That dynamic has clearly changed, at least in descriptive terms, in the way that I see it, experience with them on a daily basis. It would be interesting to understand the dynamic of that change and to have a sense for what that means, the nationalization, presumably, of party organizations, for what that means for other kinds of activity. And whether or not all this soft money has really strengthened the parties as institutions, or whether or not they're just, it's simply benefited a small group of political professionals who have captured both ends of the equation. You know, we're always looking for the enemy. We know there's somebody out there who's responsible for all this, right? And now we've decided that it's basically political consultants who are the evil force that guide us all, that prevent us from doing what we really want to do in the first place. And so they've really just, not only have they captured campaigns and made candidates sort of simply billboard signs, but they've also presumably captured the parties as well. Now, that's an empirical question. That's something we can approach with these data from party organizations and begin to get a sense for whether or not the notion that this soft money has stimulated these organizations and made them stronger coalescing features of the political process, whether or not that's really the case. It's something that we need to scrutinize. And I don't have answers, I only have questions. Moreover, the changing nature of the sources of funding for the two parties over time raises fascinating questions for how they may have changed their behavior, both as institutions and then also as, we also like to think of them at least as having some ideological component, that they generate agendas and legislative priorities that presumably guide people's decisions about which one of them they're going to support, and also guide legislatures in their decision-making process. If large contributions from a narrowing set of special interests who have defined sort of agendas before the legislature is a problem that we need to address, we might well see it in the changing nature of the sources of funds for these two national institutions over time. Again, when I started at the Commission, the RNC was really very dependent on small dollar contributions, direct mail contributions, much more so than the Democrats. One of the ongoing ironies of parties has been that the Republican Party has been, for my 20 years, the party of small givers, and the Democratic Party has been the party of large denomination contributions. Well known in Washington, but not really so well thought of outside that. That's changing though now, of course. The incentives built into the soft money process really are just pretty unavoidable, I think, for these two institutions. And so the Republican Party is quite aggressively and on equal footing with the Democrats now, dependent on much larger denomination activity from a presumably smaller set of supporters. And so to the extent that we can begin to approach that dynamic and look at the relationship between that and issue agendas and platforms and other kinds of presumably meaningful policy positions that parties espouse, although we also understand that parties are ultimately about electing candidates, and they don't typically let issue agendas get in the way of that process. It raises some questions that again get back to the role of parties and the appropriateness of their behavior and the relevance of this change in the way in which their funding takes place. On the disbursement side of the equation, what parties do with the money they get, we now have got this array of possible behavior by them that really fits nicely into the old literature and leads to some consequences, or at least we could expect, and can easily test. In the days when Gary Jacobson and Paul Herndon were doing their work on how parties strategically allocate their contribution and coordinated expenditure activity, they could afford to be strategic in those days because they could go to incumbent members, for example, and say, look, I'd love to help you out, but I'm maxed out to you in terms of contributions and coordinated expenditures, and so I'm going to devote some more resources to these open seats or these challengers to presumably vulnerable opponents. They don't have that leverage. They don't have that mechanism for strategic choices anymore. It's not a credible argument to make to anybody that I'd love to help you out, but I'm maxed out. they have, and how they choose among the different sort of arrows in the quiver these days is an interesting question to me. They can make contributions to candidates. They can make coordinated expenditures, and we'll see whether or not in this cycle they decide to make those unlimited. Certainly in 5 states, we would say they can. They would say it's much more broad than that, and we'll see what happens. They can, of course, now make independent expenditures on behalf of candidates, which takes you back to this notion of how do we make the distinction between a candidate and a party. It was conceptually inconceivable for us as an institution to say that that was possible, that parties and candidates could be somehow separated and so therefore independent of each other. It wasn't so hard for federal judges, and so therefore they can do that. How do they choose among that array of very specific, candidate-specific activities? And then you go beyond that to the use of soft money and issue advocacy and other kinds of means of supporting particular candidates in particular jurisdictions. What's the strategic mechanic that takes place here that causes them to decide that I'm going to use coordinated expenditures in this particular context and I'm going to focus on issue advocacy somewhere else? I'm not sure that there is one. I think they're probably still sorting that out, and there's no obvious logic to me that compels you to go in one direction or another, but it would be interesting to get a sense for that. And it's certainly much more complex in a strategic sense than it used to be. And that leads you to another set of actors and another change in the regulatory dynamic. Because issue advocacy has become so sanctioned now and fairly straightforward, not just for parties but for other institutions in the polity that are interested in the process, what's the dynamic? How does that change the dynamic for parties raising funds? Presumably, it was the case certainly before '96, that the party officials could go to corporations or unions or other interests and say, look, the most effective way for you to have an impact in this particular race is to give me lots of soft money because I can use it more effectively than you could. That's not obviously the case any longer. If an organization, a corporation or a union or some other association has a very specific interest in a specific campaign and they choose to make their voices heard, then clearly they have the ability to do that today. Does that change the nature of the relationship between those institutions and the parties? I don't know. But it's an interesting question, it seems to me, to pursue. Why would I choose to attempt to have indirect influence through a party organization when I can have direct influence if I want to, because I can make my presence felt in that campaign in a much more overt way. And I think we need to better understand that part of the process as well. All of those are very generic, sort of broad brush kinds of questions, but they focus on the kinds of things that certainly the courts are concerned about, that the Congress would be concerned about, I think, in any sort of reform agenda, and therefore they have, to some extent, more relevance to me. This has been a pretty normative discussion, I suppose, and I'll stop with another kind of normative plea, I suppose. To me, the thing that's changed most, the greatest impact that this process, this evolution of the process, explosion, if you will, of the old FECA-based regulatory structure, the biggest impact to me is that there are real questions now about what the rule of law means, and whether or not the people who are most active in the process of creating laws have much regard for them once they're there. If it's the case that we can just continue to find new and innovative ways to avoid regulation, then what does that say about us as legislators or as a polity? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that one either, but it's clearly, I think, the case that the current situation is one where there isn't much legitimacy left in this process. If the electorate understands, and they pretty clearly do, that this is a game without rules, but that we pretend that we continue to have these rules on the books, then we're in a pretty awkward situation, it seems to me, from a small d democratic standpoint. It would be better just to get rid of the rules, perhaps, than to maintain this kind of dichotomy between what we say the regulatory structure is and what the reality of the political process is. And maybe you can help us with that kind of discussion as well.